Good evening. Welcome to the Majors and Quinn Facebook page and YouTube channel. My name is Annie. I'm the events coordinator for Majors and Quinn Booksellers, which is an independent bookstore in Minneapolis, Minnesota. If it's your first virtual event with us, welcome. Thanks for being here. Thanks for tuning in. If it's not your first, welcome back. Thank you so much for your continued support of our events program, even as it switched over into the virtual event era. It's been really fun talking to authors this way over the past year. And we are really excited tonight that's my cat, to be able to talk to authors Christopher Elias and Kevin Boyle. We're going to be talking about Chris's new book, Gossip Men, J. Edgar Hoover, Joe McCarthy, Roy Cohn, and the Politics of Insinuation. Should be a fascinating discussion. I'm going to be putting a link to that book at the Majors and Quinn website into the chat. If you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, it'll be in the comments or the chat section. And speaking of that section, wherever you're watching from, say hi, let us know where you're tuning in from. If you have any questions, please write those down. You can write those at any time during the broadcast. We will take questions towards the end of the hour. I'll be back to handle those, but really you can, anytime you think of them, write them down. We are going to hear a little bit from the book, but mostly have this conversation between Chris and Kevin. I'm just going to introduce these two speakers first, and then we will get this show on the road. Christopher M. Elias is visiting assistant professor of history and American studies at St. Olaf College. This fall, he'll begin a new position as assistant professor of history at the American University in Cairo, Egypt. Gossip Men is his first book. So thank you so much for being here, Christopher, and congratulations on the first book. And we have in conversation with him, Kevin Boyle, who is the William Smith Mason Professor of American History at Northwestern University. His publications include the UAW and the Heyday of American Liberalism, 1945 to 1968, Muddy Boots and Ragged Aprons, Images of Working Class Detroit, 1900 to 1930, with Victoria Geddes, Organized Labor and American Politics, 1894 to 1994, and Arc of Justice, a saga of race, civil rights, and murder in the Jazz Age, which received the National Book Award for Nonfiction, the Chicago Tribune's Heartland Prize, and the Simon Wiesenthal Center's Tolerance Book Award. Kevin, thank you so much for being here too, and I am so looking forward to hearing this conversation. I'll be back at the end of the show to do questions. Bye.
Thanks so much, Annie, and Chris, thanks so much for letting me join you tonight.
Thanks for being here. It's wonderful.
I am so excited that your book is out. It's such a fabulous book. I just have to say how much I enjoyed it. And I thought we could start our conversation tonight by starting where you start. So you start the book with the 1954 Army McCarthy hearings. And there's only one moment, as far as I know, in the Army McCarthy hearings that made it famous. For 4 years, Joseph McCarthy was rampaging across American politics. He was the dominant figure in American politics. And at the Army McCarthy hearings, the Army's lawyer, Joseph Welch, called him out. Finally, the most famous moment, the only moment I think people know from those hearings, is when Joseph Welch says to Joe McCarthy, "Have you no decency, sir? At long last, have you no decency?" It's one of the iconic moments of the 1950s. And you give us an entirely different moment from those hearings. So I thought it would be great if you would just tell us about that moment.
Yeah, wonderful. And before I do, just thank you so much for being here. And thanks to Annie and Majors and Quinn and everybody watching. This is really exciting and wonderful. I can tell you the sense of decency moment and the sense of decency quote from Welch has, really continues to have a life of its own. I have an alert on Joe McCarthy, a Google alert, and almost every single day there's an op-ed where somebody on the political spectrum is saying, Nancy Pelosi have you no sense of decency, Donald Trump have you no sense of decency. So it doesn't matter who you're critiquing, the quote still has some purchase. So I think I'll start by reading, because this is my opening move in the book, and I'm just going to read for 5 minutes, and this is how I start, and then maybe we can talk about a little bit why I start this way, but I'll start by reading for us a little bit. The hearing room was sweating. Though the weather was mild, partly cloudy with a high of 74 degrees, the temperature inside the Senate caucus room kept climbing steadily. An ornate space designed for 300 occupants. On this day, it was packed with 800. Even congressmen were sometimes escorted out by apologetic Capitol policemen who cited fire codes. Klieg lights and television cameras cramped the chamber even further, and the heat from the bulbs pushed the temperature higher. But any discomfort felt by those in attendance was secondary to the need to broadcast the hearings to the 20 million people watching on television. The hearings became the most watched live event in television's infant history, offering a clear look at the phenomenon already known as McCarthyism, referring to both Wisconsin Senator Joseph R. McCarthy's campaign against communist subversives in the federal government, and to his controversial tactics. For over 4 years, McCarthy has mesmerized the nation and attracted millions of fawning supporters. He had created a serial drama that promised glimpses into the clandestine operations and backroom dealings of the era's most pressing geopolitical concern, the fight against communism. Since the end of World War II, the United States had been gripped by fears that the Soviet Union and the global communist movement were conspiring to destroy Western-style capitalism and democracy. The threat required constant vigilance against domestic subversion, and McCarthy's rapid rise to power had largely been fueled by his promise to protect the nation. But McCarthy and his crusade were also deeply controversial. Critics accused him of trampling individual liberties, attacking innocent federal employees, flouting civil discourse, and fabricating evidence. Even members of his own party spoke out against McCarthy, charging him with promoting, quote, a national feeling of fear and frustration that could result in national suicide and the end of everything that we Americans hold dear. That was Margaret Trace Smith from Maine. Now McCarthyism faced its most substantial test. The U.S. Army had accused McCarthy and his top aide, Roy M. Cohn, of seeking preferential treatment for G. David Schein, a recently drafted private who was both a McCarthy staffer and Cohn's close friend. In turn, McCarthy and Cohn charged that the Army was using Schein's draft status to thwart McCarthy's investigation of both communists and homosexuals in its ranks. The former were cast as sworn enemies of the American experiment, the latter as deviant fellow travelers who were inherently subversive. As the caucus room filled in the afternoon of April 30th, 1954, questioning turned to a photograph that McCarthy had presented to support his case. Special counsel for the Army, Joseph Nye Welch, noted that the image had been cropped, and he wondered aloud where the photograph had originated and who had ordered that doctoring. On the stand sat a perspiring Jim Giuliano, the McCarthy assistant who had prepared the print, pudgy-faced and dressed in a baggy suit. After Giuliano repeatedly pled ignorance, Welch asked whether he thought the photograph, quote, came from a pixie. Welch's sarcasm was characteristic, but this comment cut more deeply than previous barbs, and the audience's light laughter at it was mixed with guffaws of deeper understanding. For many months, both McCarthy and Cohn had been hounded by rumors that they themselves were homosexuals and were perhaps intent on securing preferential treatment for Schein because one, or maybe even both of them, was having a homosexual affair with him. Keenly aware of the large audience and hoping to parry Welch's attack, McCarthy asked Welch to define the term pixie, suggesting that Welch was possibly an expert on the subject. Welch replied, with a grin, that a pixie, quote, is a close relative of a fairy, and asked if he had enlightened McCarthy. As the audience burst into even greater laughter, the television feed cut from a view of the entire caucus room to tighter shots of Welch, McCarthy, and those seated with them. Viewers could see the senator chuckle and roll his eyes knowingly. Next to him, Cohn, just 27 years old, but with heavy bags under his eyes, tried to smile, but a look of frustration washed over him. He shifted nervously, his shoulders slumped. and he dropped his gaze to the table, or possibly to his hands. And so that's where I start, and that's where the reading begins, and that's what I'm going to read just to get us started today in response to Kevin's question. But to respond to that question of why I start there, it's really, Kevin, what you suggest. We are told in our textbooks, in U.S. history, that this moment is memorable because of the larger geopolitical concerns circulating around it, the issues of security, the issues of what it means to be American, and how can we protect American identity from this march of communism that has replaced fascism as the bête noire in American dreams at this moment. And here is this homosexual, homophobic dancer that is being used, and these slurs being passed around. And I kind of said, stop, wait a minute. Why is this happening? Why is this the way that these men, and they were all men, communicating at this moment when we've been told that it's not about social issues or cultural issues in the United States, but rather about this major issue of national security? And so I really just began with that question. I wanted to follow the strings wherever that pulled me. And I think that's the book kind of goes from there.
And where it goes is back in time. That what you see as the centerpiece of the story is this tangle, right, between masculinity and this growing surveillance state and gossip. And in that tangle, the person that you see is really representative of that is the third person in your title, J. Edgar Hoover, the longtime head of the FBI.
Mm-hmm.
Hoover.
It's a great question, and the short, pithy answer is just Hoover is just such a fascinating person, right? he has it all. You can continue reading about him forever and find out something new, but he does a couple of things. Number one, most kind of logistically, is longevity. He's born in 1895. He takes over the Bureau of Investigation in 1924. That becomes the FBI about 10 years later, right? And he stays there in that job until 1972. He survives presidents that kind of like him. He survives presidents that really don't like him. And he's able to have this staying power. So you have this arch that you can follow through this man that gives you this wide swath of American history, or at least the first half of the 20th century. But the other thing that I love about Hoover is perhaps because he had that staying power, he's a person that has feet in a number of different areas of historical imagination. And in some ways, he's very Victorian, right? Born in the 1890s, he's born into upper middle class family in Washington, D.C. In the book, I write that he was literally born into bureaucracy because so many of his people, his brother, his father, his uncle, his grandfather, all worked for the government in some capacity, right? And in some ways, he has this 19th century series of morals, understanding of class, understanding of perhaps even what justice is to some degree. So he's rooted in that consciousness. But then at the same time, he becomes very modern, and he modernizes the FBI. He introduces all of these scientific policing tactics. He's one of the first people to really say that the FBI needs to have training in fingerprinting and building a card catalog that can be cross-referenced of different, both criminals and certainly subversives, political subversives in the United States, inspired by something that the U.S. Army Intelligence Division had done in the Philippines. He absolutely changes the way that FBI agents, instead of being these kind of Texas Ranger cowboys, he professionalizes them. And he doesn't want to get rid of necessarily the masculine mystique surrounding them. In fact, he amplifies it to some degree, but he also wants to smooth the rough edges. He wants to professionalize the Bureau. He wants to make it into something that the country can really look up to, and most of the men he hires either have law or accounting degrees. But then finally, perhaps most importantly for my argument, Hoover uses the modern media perhaps more adeptly than any other bureaucrat of his age, right? And what he does in this way is he uses the media to characterize the FBI and present it in the way that he wants to in comic books and movies and short serials that played before movies, these short serialized films, in radio shows, in novelizations, in op-eds that he was writing himself or ghostwritten or had ghostwritten for himself, right? So he's using modern mass media to amplify the legend of the FBI, but he's also using modern mass media to amplify the legend of himself. And this way that he is able to use his kind of professional credibility, his intellect, and then certainly this understanding of him as a masculine leader for a new time who can combine both kind of white-collar bureaucracy and old-school masculine toughness in order to do something new with the United States government and do something new with policing in the country is really one of the reasons he's such a fascinating character. He lets you get at and think about so many things. And then, of course, the bonus here is that as Hoover is using the mass media, as he is using gossip himself to implicate color and attack his enemies, he himself ends up getting bitten by gossip and becomes one of the nation's greatest victims, if you can think of J. Edgar Hoover as a victim, victims of gossip ultimately, or at least his memory becomes a victim of gossip about him.
So those of us of a certain age can really immediately relate to the idea of the FBI using mass media because we grew up with the FBI TV show doing the sort of thing, glorifying the FBI. One of the things you mentioned at the end there, Chris, really hooks me, is that it hooked me with the book, is that one of the things that Hoover does explicitly is he puts himself into the gossip columns, into the celebrity columns in the 1930s and 40s. You have this wonderful picture of him at a nightclub with this silly little New Year's Eve hat on, posing for the camera, in his suit. What was it like to work with the sources you worked with to get to that gossip side of your analysis? I mean, I'd imagine it's a lot of fun, but they've got to be tricky sources too.
Yeah, and I think that's part of what makes them so fascinating. From a just finding the sources standpoint, nobody is going home right now and putting this week's edition of the National Enquirer or Weekly World News in the slipcover and saying, my grandkids were going to really want to see this story about Bat Boy or something, right? And so in one way, it's very difficult to get at them. But the other fascinating thing, going back to Hoover, is Hoover understands that these magazines are reaching a really broad audience, right? And it's not only gossip magazines and tabloids, it's also the writers themselves, Walter Winchell maybe being the most important. And a lot of columnists start to pivot so that they cross this line between celebrity gossip and political reportage. And so there's this new form of political gossip that starts to be widely read and spread during, I'd say, beginning in really the 1930s, but certainly explodes in the 1950s, and that's part of why the book is placed where it is. But gossip magazines are fascinating because, number one, there's a challenge. It's a mystery, right? You have to, in a lot of the mainstream gossip columns, whether it's Walter Winchell or Drew Pearson or anybody of that ilk, David Lawrence, less gossipy, more political. But in any of those columns that are published in the mainstream press and kind of the buttoned up press, you need to read between the lines, right? And so part of the fun was looking between the lines and seeing, okay, when Collier says that J. Edgar Hoover walks with a mincing step and wears this color Eleanor blue, which is really a lavender, is somebody reading it in 1933 going to get that this is a reference possibly to his sexuality, right? The mincing step and lavender being a color that was by the 1930s already clearly associated with homosexuality, right? So there's a little bit of that. On the other side, I think you can see gossip magazines as legitimate sources of political information, not necessarily because what they were reporting was accurate, but because what they were reporting gives us insight into what the zeitgeist thought was important at that moment, right? What people were wanting to read about, what people were wanting to think about, and quite frankly, what gossip magazine creators thought was going to sell, right? And so when you start to see stories about homosexuality in politicians, when you start to see, quite frankly, gossip about politicians, it tells you that the creators of these gossip magazines, and they had all these wonderful titles, Hush Hush and Tattle and Confidential and all these other ones, Top Secret. What it tells you is that there are people who are interested in reading political gossip, right? And it's starting to shape, and yes, it's entertaining, but it's also starting to shape public perceptions of these figures. And so then the other half of the gossip magazines and understanding how this information was received is then going back to what we would think of as maybe more traditional historical sources, like letters that were written to senators, and opening these letters from constituents and saying, oh, this constituent says that in the most recent edition of Confidential, I read this thing about Elias Stevenson. Is it right? If it's right, we definitely need to do something about it. So you then can, it's really tough to ask people whether or not they read a gossip magazine, because number one, they don't want to admit to it. And number two, it's not something that often people wrote down in traditional historical sources, but like letters and diaries and things of that nature. But a way to figure out their importance and their spread is to look at how these rumors came back and circulated back to people, and how they then were disseminated.
So you said a couple minutes ago that the idea of sort of political gossip in the gossip magazines and in the gossip columns, which I think is really important to, as you said, really started in the 1930s, but it kind of reached a peak in the 1950s, which is the height of the Cold War. Do you think looking at those sources and reading that sort of political gossip has changed your sense of Cold War politics?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it has. Gossip. Part of the reason gossip magazines explode in the 1950s, there's a logistical reason. The paper rationing of the Second World War ends, I believe, in 1947, and as a result, it's much cheaper to create things. So you have all these one-offs where people start printing these magazines to say, okay, let's see if this works. Let's see if this works. Very famously, Hugh Hefner does not put a date on the first issue of Playboy because he doesn't know if it's going to sell, right? So he doesn't want it to be sitting on, and there are a bunch of these magazines that only last 2 or 3 issues or maybe 6 months worth of issues because of that. But people are experimenting, trying to make a quick buck, and putting forward their best money-making ideas. But I think that when we think of gossip as a source of political information, the other thing that gossip is riding on, and why gossip magazines and columnists are becoming so important at this moment in political discourse, is because there's this overarching understanding that information suddenly has this incredible purchase, right? That information, that gossip about your neighbor, that your neighbor is an alcoholic, or that your neighbor is somebody who might have attended communist meetings when he was in college in the 1930s, right, is no longer just cocktail party conversation. It's also something that could necessarily be used for national security. And so, but to get back to your question, Kevin, this idea that did it change my conception of the Cold War? The way that I came to the Cold War originally, and I think a lot of us came to the Cold War, was through these moments of tense geopolitical drama, right? It's through the Berlin airlift. It's through the Bay of Pigs invasion. It's through the Cuban Missile Crisis. And we think of the Cold War really impacting this top tier of American political concerns, and it did, without a doubt. But one of the things that gossip magazines have taught me, and this is something that is not something original to me, it's something that people have been talking about generally when looking at Cold War culture, is the degree to which the fear of communism and the degree to which the anxieties that were wrought by nuclear warfare and the possibilities of a modern nuclear holocaust seeped into the pores of Americans and seeped into their consciousness, right? And that even in the lingo, even in the vernacular that gossip magazines are using, talking about Reds this and Reds that, and Lavender Lads, and portraying Soviets in a certain way, shows you just the degree to which it's with the national consciousness on a daily basis. And I know, we've all seen the fallout shelter signs on the side of buildings and things like that. But even beyond that, right, that we are living in an age where this is the dominant frame for how a number of people see the world, and it really affects almost everything you do. And so that, even gossip magazines. And so that's really where I think the rubber hit the road for me as far as how it changed how I think about the Cold War and why Cold War politics are so dense and fascinating.
And that's exactly right, the tangle that you put at the center of this book. That's that tangle of that surveillance state and you don't know who you can trust, and finding that little bit of gossip about your neighbors can have these devastating effects. And that's that link between gossip and the surveillance state that you see as central. And the masculinity kind of brings us around, I think, to Joe McCarthy and Roy Cohn, right?
Absolutely.
Here are two of these quintessential figures of that really height of the Cold War, and that's where they come into your story. These guys are really different than J. Edgar Hoover. These people, Joe McCarthy and Roy Cohn, they don't fit that profile you were describing for us earlier. They're really different, and yet somehow they fit into that same tangle too, right?
Right, absolutely. And I think the thing that unites all three of them, without a doubt, is ambition. And this deep desire for power. There's a cynical reading I could say, well, deep desire for power, no matter how they could get that. And to some degree, I subscribe to that. Very famously, McCarthy was a registered Democrat and became a Republican because that was the way to be known in Wisconsin politics in the 1930s and 1940s, right? There was an opportunity for that. The Democratic Party was basically dead. Didn't provide avenues for him, excuse me. And so McCarthy and Cohn, I think what they do is a couple things. Number one, because of their varied backgrounds, McCarthy, the son of Irish Catholic immigrants from Ireland, growing up in rural Wisconsin, shows us the ways in which he could take the professional masculinity that J. Edgar Hoover was preaching and preaching the gospel of, and turn it into more of a blue-collar, hard-working masculinity that maybe we're a little bit more comfortable seeing in American culture today, right? That in order to advertise his masculine bona fides, he could very easily talk about his time working on the farm. When he's campaigning for Senate in 1946, he'll go up to the houses of Wisconsin farmers, introduce himself, always as Joe, right? Never as Judge McCarthy, which he was at the time, and say, hey, you got a cow out back? I'd love to keep my hands in. I'll do some milking for you today, right? So he has this, there's elements of class there, there's elements of physical labor there. And so in some way, McCarthy and then Cohn show how malleable this understanding of masculinity could be, even as we see it as concurrently rigid in certain ways, right? It's rigid in its focus on the aggressive. It's rigid in its focus on the actively heterosexual, right? A similar thing can be said for Roy Cohn, who grew up in relative wealth in the Bronx, and his father was a judge, a democratically appointed judge, but his family was also Jewish. So Cohn has this somewhat outsider status because of his religious and ethnic background that he basically uses masculinity in some ways to overcome, right? And specifically his sense of how masculinity gains him more power. And if somebody's powerful and if they can make a change just by picking up the phone, that's true power. And it doesn't really matter what religious background you come from, as long as you have this influence. So I think both of these guys show us the malleability of masculinity, and then as well, they're picking up on the trail that Hoover has trailblazed as far as thinking about how to use gossip, how to use gossip columnists for to characterize yourself, to create a persona, to make yourself palatable to a public audience, and to grow your both your public stature and your level of political power.
And they've got something else in common too, right? So Joe McCarthy is elected, right? You said in 46 to the U.S. Senate.
Right, in that Republican wave.
His big breakthrough in 1950 with his infamous speech about, I have in my hand a list of how many ever are communists, right? And
right.
Roy Cohn signed, he makes his name, I didn't know this until I read your book. He made his name really kind of on the edges of the Edgar Hiss case, right? And then he joins, when does he join Joe McCarthy's staff?
He joins McCarthy's staff actually relatively late. It's the end of 52. They have this kind of flirtation, and then he joins officially, I think, in January of 53, if I'm remembering the dates correctly.
Okay. So that was kind of an aside, I suppose, just to say that from a pretty early stage, right, with Joe McCarthy and obviously with Roy Cohn, there are rumors that they are both themselves gay men from a pretty early stage, and it's kind of floating around. And I just have to add that many years ago, I was doing some research in the Kennedy Library, the Kennedy Presidential Library, in the Bobby Kennedy papers, who had a connection with the whole McCarthy thing. He's got, in his official records in the Kennedy Library, he has a copy of one of the gossip magazines about Joe McCarthy and whether Joe McCarthy is gay or not. And he's marked it up. He underlined key parts of it. So those rumors were floating around for a good long time. And yet the two of them play this anti-gay politics that's fused with the anti-communist politics. Why are they playing such a dangerous game here?
I don't want to mix fact and fiction here, mix history and fiction, but Tony Kushner has a line about this in Angels in America that is just so good. You want it to be true that Roy Cohn said this, right? And so I'll quote it, and it's Roy Cohn replying in the 1980s later, when he is a famous lawyer and fixer, to accusations that he's gay, by saying, I'm too powerful to be gay. Homosexuals don't have any power. I have power. Ergo, I can't be homosexual. So in some way, my answer to this question is for Cohn, who did have homosexual relationships, whether or not he thought of himself as gay, I think in some ways he believes that he has too much power for this ever to come back and cause a problem for him, right? Even though these rumors are circulating around, right? McCarthy is a little bit different. I don't believe necessarily, and I don't know if there's enough evidence for us to say that McCarthy engaged in any homosexual liaisons, right? There is this, there are a number of different stories that were collected by his nemesis, Drew Pearson, about him being in certain gay bars in Wisconsin, of kissing a young man on the night of the Republican State Convention in Wisconsin, I believe, in either 48 or 50, right? So Drew Pearson is collecting this dirt on McCarthy. But as far as I'm concerned, if I had to guess, I don't think McCarthy is necessarily engaged in homosexual relationships, activities, behavior. But the fact that it's used against him, the fact that this is the sockdology, right? The fact that this is the ammunition that the people who hate McCarthy the most go to. Hank Greenspun, a newspaper owner, reporter for the Las Vegas Sun, the two things that he constantly goes against McCarthy for are either one, that he is a communist fascist, anti-Semitic communist fascist, or that number two, he is gay. And that is where those rumors about McCarthy's homosexuality first find their way into print. And so I think the fact that this is seen as such sharp ammunition, right? This is seen as such potent ammunition, tells us something about the ways in which homosexuality is used as a political tool in the early 1950s, and then, of course, throughout the 50s and 60s, as indicated by David Johnson's book, The Lavender Scare. And so, two different people. So in some ways, I don't think Cohn thinks that he can be brought down. Because if he was really worried about it, he would go farther to hide it, right? But he's having these pretty open parties in Provincetown at a house that he rents every summer with men coming around. He's showing up to Reagan's White House in 1984 with his boyfriend on his arm, basically introducing him to Nancy Reagan. And so I think that Cohn thought he was too powerful for this to ever impact him. And I think that's really telling both about his character and about his position in American politics at the time.
Which then brings us around to that opening scene again, right? That it turns out to be in this complicated tangle that you've given us all along of masculinity and of the surveillance state and of the gossip, the power of gossip and the power of innuendo, that McCarthyism is, well, Joe McCarthy at least, is brought down, right? That it's out of that whole combination of that moment on TV, right? Mm-hmm. A new medium for spreading gossip, that everything comes crashing down for Joe McCarthy. And it's tied with, obviously, Roy Cohn and this relationship he was having. But as you just pointed out, Roy Cohn doesn't exactly disappear from American political.
If only he did, right?
I mean, Joe McCarthy only lives another 3 years, but Roy Cohn's there in American political life for decades and decades afterwards. And I don't know, I seem to remember reading somewhere that he had some sort of connection to another politician who seems to have done pretty well for himself in recent years. I mean,
in recent years, yeah.
And it seems as if we can't avoid talking just a little bit about the ways in which the politics you're describing have endured now into the Trump Trump years.
The Trump years, right.
And it's Roy Cohn who provides us that bridge.
Right. Well, first, as you note, McCarthy dies almost certainly of complications related to alcoholism in 1957. My father-in-law grew up in Appleton. He tells us a great story of being young and seeing all these cars go by, and he goes out to his sidewalk because he thinks it's a parade. It was actually Joe McCarthy's funeral. So McCarthy dies in May of '57. But yeah, Cohn is the bad penny, or maybe the more common reference is like the cockroach that can't be done away with in some ways, right? He ends up having this second career as a connected New York lawyer and political fixer for the Gambino crime family, for George Steinbrenner, who, in my view, as a Boston Red Sox fan, is just as evil as anybody he could work with. And then he ends up working for the gentleman who owns Studio 54. But it is in the late 70s and early 80s that he makes this connection with Donald Trump and his father, Fred, because the Trumps are being sued by the federal government on the basis of not allowing or not providing equitable housing in a number of the apartment buildings they own in New York City. And so Cohn and Trump, I think, latch on to each other for numerous reasons. They supposedly meet at a club called Le Club, very innovatively, called Le Club in New York City in the late 70s. And they latch on to each other because I think they recognize something in each other, this larger-than-life personality, this salesmanship, this, I would argue, chicanery in some ways, right? This con man aspect about them. And they really seem to, for that half decade, a little bit more, feed off of each other in many ways. And so it's tempting to see in some ways that Donald Trump is taking a page out of the McCarthy, Cohn, Hoover playbook in the way he uses his masculinity, in the way that he presents himself as a celebrity, in the way that he uses gossip magazines. The only national newspaper to support, or newspaper with a circulation of over, I think it was 200,000, to endorse Trump in the 2016 election is the National Enquirer, right? And so in many ways, Trump has this bit that connects him with Cohn, but I think perhaps the thing that connects them the largest and the best is their their fungibility with the truth. How about that? We'll say that, which is this idea that the truth doesn't necessarily matter. The facts of the matter aren't important as long as you hold the biggest microphone. And the best example for that is the Trump Foundation, or the Trump Organization, ends up settling with the federal government. They admit to engaging in discriminatory housing practices. And I think they end up paying a fine, and they end up saying, okay, we'll be better. Of course, they're again sued a couple of years later, so they didn't follow through with it. But they have settled. They admit to some degree wrongdoing, if not legally, then certainly kind of ethically. And Roy Cohn goes out to the proverbial microphones and says, "We're so happy that the federal government has seen the error of their ways and backed off. We're so happy that the Trump Organization has been proven to be truthful in this matter." And so, again, from the get-go of their relationship, there is this model that Cohn is setting for Trump, allowing that Trump, or showing Trump, I should say, that so long as you can control the narrative, so long as you can dictate what people are talking about, the truth of the matter is almost immaterial. And we've certainly seen that, I think, with the last 3 months of the Trump administration and the lies about the 2020 election and electioneering that was happening, or election fraud, that was happening there.
I have to admit that I'm really struck on a small point you made that just kind of lodged in my head the minute you made it, Chris, that they met at a place called Look Club. I have to go all the way back to my basic high school French class to say that it's interesting they use the masculine rather than the feminine in the club. This has been absolutely fascinating, and I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed our conversation. And I really want to congratulate you again on the book.
Thank you.
It's a terrific achievement. It's a terrific read. It was so great to hear you reading that opening scene this evening. But I don't really want to hog all of your time. So I think what I'd like to do is I'd like to open things up to questions from our virtual audience.
Great.
Well, that was great. It looks like we have one question so far, and if you're just thinking of your question, write it down in the chat if you're watching on YouTube, or in the comments if you're watching on Facebook. I will also remind you that the book is available at through Majors and Quinn. You can go ahead and give us a call. I will put the phone number in there to place an order, or I just put a link to the website. So here's a question from Hal, and forgive me if I'm reading it wrong, but had there been a deal with Welch not dealing with the homosexual innuendo if Cohn McCarthy did not bring up Welch associate Fred Fisher's connection to the National Lawyers Guild? I don't think I have enough context to know how
No. That's a great question, and it's something that has circulated for a number of years about this moment. Fred Fisher was a junior associate and a recent Harvard Law graduate that was in Joseph Nye Welch's law firm in Boston. It was called Hale and Dorr. And Fisher had, during his, I believe his undergraduate days, belonged to a club on campus that had been identified by the McCarthy committee and McCarthy's own investigators as being a communist front club, right? It was a Young Lawyers of America or Future Lawyers of America club that McCarthy had claimed at one point was a young thing. And the suggestion is that McCarthy and Welch had a backroom understanding whereby if Welch didn't bring up anything about rumors of Cohn's homosexuality, or actually more specifically, rumors of Cohn dodging the draft, either one of these things. Sometimes dodging the draft, the story goes, sometimes it's about rumors of his sexuality, then McCarthy would agree not to raise this thing about Fisher, But when Cohn is on the stand, there is a suggestion that Welch goes after him or says things in the room that, as I think Hal put in the chat, there's a suggestion that McCarthy feels like that Welch on the deal, in the sense that he basically says he goes after Cohn for personal things. And so knowing that, the gloves come off from McCarthy about Fred Fisher, and he brings up that issue about his enrollment in this group, and then ultimately the fairy pixie exchange kind of happens, ultimately the have you no sense of decency thing also happens as a result of this bare knuckle brawling that they become involved in.
Gotcha. Well, thank you. That's great detail. Here's one from Chris. How does social media parallel the gossip magazines that you examined in the book in terms of affecting political discourse and reputations? Are there key similarities or differences? Great question.
Yeah, it's a wonderful, wonderful question. In some way, you'd like to say that the key difference is that social media has absolutely no editorial oversight whatsoever, right? And that somebody can tweet something out in 280 characters or throw it on Facebook or put it wherever, and then it's there. But in many ways, I would argue that the gossip magazines at the time didn't have much editorial oversight either, right? It wasn't like, if something was juicy, it was going in there. Although there has been, at the same time, there has been some wonderful work done by a number of people. Harry Scott is one of them, who has shown that a number of the things that ended up in gossip magazines, like Confidential, were mostly true, right? And this actually kept the creators of this magazine from being sued, because they knew that if they were sued for libel by these stars and politicians they were talking about, then it would have to go to discovery, and it would have to go to an open court, and that would be perhaps disastrous for the celebrity. The other interesting thing that a number of these gossip magazines did was they would hold back on one key part of piece of information. So this senator is having an affair, and this is the hotel it happened in, but they wouldn't say that the affair was with an underage woman, right? Or wouldn't say that the affair was with the wife of a fellow senator or something like that. I'm just making it up right now. But they would hold that piece of information in reserve in order to ensure that when the senator or somebody from his office came knocking and saying, what is this? You need to retract it. They say, we're not going to retract it, and if you keep pushing us, we'll let this other piece out. The repercussions aspect of this question is really fantastic, and it has me thinking. I'm going to have to think about it some more, certainly. But the repercussions are, I would say, pretty similar, right? Once a piece of information is in the ether, right? Once a piece of information is out, there's not so much that you can do to put the toothpaste back in the tube, right? And so on social media, if you say the Dominion voting systems, you witnessed somebody in an airplane hangar in Arizona fudging with something, or the Dominion voting systems, you know somebody that works with them, is definitely screwing with the algorithm, right? The truth of it, no matter what anyone says, isn't necessarily going to matter to anybody who then has already read this piece. And so the truth that McCarthy was likely not homosexual, and more than anything was probably a pretty profound and prolific womanizer, right, doesn't necessarily matter if you've already read in Rave magazine that McCarthy has a stable of young men he visits every time he goes back to Milwaukee, right? And so I think that's the other key thing, that we have this issue in this country, and we have, and this is not, this goes back to, Grover Cleveland and, Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, right? We have this, which of course ended up being true, but we have this issue that once a rumor is out, there's not too much you can do to stop it.
Yeah, and same with social media. So here's one from Carrie. How did you manage gossip versus fact in your research? Were you left with gray area or lingering doubts?
Yeah, I think the way I managed it is I tried to avoid it as much as possible. I really tried to never come down and say, okay, this is definitely true. And even tonight we're talking about McCarthy's sexuality. I'm hedging, right? I'm saying, well, I'm not sure if this is totally true, maybe, right? And so I think what I tried to argue in the book is that the fact that these rumors exist is almost as important as whether or not they are true, right? And that's not to say that truth doesn't matter, but for my purposes as a historian, because I can't determine whether or not Joe McCarthy is gay, and I can't determine whether J. Edgar Hoover was gay, and even this idea that Hoover might have been gay is a modern conception of sexuality that we're putting on a man who may have been asexual or gay in certain circumstances and straight in others, or whatever it may be. Because we can't determine the truth of that and be honest with both ourselves and the readers and a historical audience, I really try to lean towards saying, okay, the fact that this existed, the fact that this gets picked up matters, right? And I referred to earlier, one of my favorite pieces here about Hoover is the fact that he had this incredible career, right? He's arguably, you could make an argument that he is the most important American bureaucrat of the 20th century, certainly. You could also say that he was maybe the most important figure in Washington, D.C. in the 20th century. I know people would argue FDR, Lyndon Johnson, whoever, right? But it's at least you can make the argument. When I sit down with somebody on a train, when we used to do that, or a Thanksgiving table, and say, oh, I'm working on J. Edgar Hoover, they'll say, oh, the guy in the dress. Right, because the rumors about J. Edgar Hoover's cross-dressing have become so well-known, so profound, so in the kind of national consciousness to the degree that we have one in 2021, that all of this other stuff that he did, even COINTELPRO, he's spying on Martin Luther King Jr., right? He's involved in taking down leftist individuals, Black Panthers, all of this crazy stuff that has a profound effect on American consciousness, supporting white supremacy, all this other stuff, right? We forget all of that, and we just want to hear about him in a pair of pumps and a negligee. And in some ways, it's a little bit delightful to think that somebody who used gossip against other people so powerfully is now remembered in American consciousness as for this piece of gossip rather than as the political dynamo that he was.
All right. Well, thank you, Carrie, for that question. I think maybe we might be getting another question. It looks like someone might be typing. Until we have another question come in, I'll ask one just because this was your first book. So can you tell us a little bit about your process? How did this become the book that you wanted to do and be your first book?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I'm stealing from other historians who I love. Kevin, of course, being one of them, Lou Mazur at Rutgers being another, who are so good at putting story at the center of their writing. And I think narrative is so important to the way we understand each other, both interpersonally and then the way we understand history. And so I wanted to do something that had a really strong narrative core at the center. I wanted there to be this moment like that Pixie Fairy exchange that I opened the book with and that we opened our discussion with tonight, that we can explode, that brings questions to the fore, that allows us to think critically about larger issues, but then also allows the reader to kind of follow along with this mystery. Why the heck did this happen? Why are they talking in this way? What is going to happen with these individuals and with these rumors? Where did they come from? How are they spread? Right? And then you start from the micro history and then build out and try to say, okay, what does this tell us about the national security state? What does this tell us about how information circulated in the United States more generally? What does this tell us about the blind spots in, as Kevin asked me earlier, the ways that we think about the Cold War and how the era in our imagination might be profoundly different from the era as lived experience. And so that's why I started it there. And then, man, it is fun at looking at 1950s gossip magazines. Like the advertisements are fantastic, right? They're all the same things we're worried about today, right? It's all about quick weight loss things, how to, have a better presentation to other people, how to get a date, how to have a he-man, manly speaking voice, right? It's both satisfying and really horrifying to think that the American populace hasn't really changed that much in 75 years. So that was really fun. And then it brought together a way of thinking about American culture. And I really do like doing cultural history and looking at political history, but from a cultural standpoint. So, what can this thing that we seemingly think is easy to dismiss, gossip magazines, what can we see of those things that allows us to better understand some of the bigger questions? And so it was really fun, and I think future projects will be the same way, trying to keep story at the center of it.
Well, great. Thank you for that. And I think so we just got a hello. Hi, Jaden. So if we don't have any further questions, speak right now or we won't see it. Kevin, do you have any final thoughts or questions you wanted to throw to?
I've got one quick follow-up actually from your question, Annie. So when you're writing about these really fascinating people, I don't know if you felt this, but I'm curious to know whether you did or not. Did you find one of them more compelling than another? Do you have a favorite? Favorite's the wrong word, but the one that get up and write about one of these people, this is the one you had the most fun writing about.
Oh, maybe I'm sentimental because I'm in the upper Midwest now, but I don't think Joe McCarthy gets a bad rap. Don't get me wrong. Please don't, take that out of quotes. Joe McCarthy was not great. I think he was a true believer. And I think he was somebody who thought that what he was doing really mattered. And he is, to answer Karl Rove's infamous question in 2004, the one I'd most like to get a beer with out of these three. But I don't necessarily. Yeah, Kevin, you're right. Favorite is a very difficult word to.
Yeah, it's not the right word. Sorry about that.
But I think the other kind of long car ride question: who would you most have as the dinner guest? Would definitely be Roy Cohn, because he was just kind of so absurd and entertaining. But McCarthy, for some reason, maybe because he's Irish Catholic and I grew up Irish Catholic in some ways, I think that there's something there about him that is compelling. And I do think he was actually brilliant. He did get through, basically did all of his high school courses in 1 year. He got through his undergraduate in 3 years. I think he was a very smart, very driven, really compelling character. And so that's why there's a soft spot in my heart for Joe McCarthy. I can never run for any kind of political office now that I've said that publicly.
Sadly enough, I'm not sure that's true, Chris.
That probably isn't true at all.
So we do have one more question from Jaden. We'll do that as our final one. As it relates to the relationship between Roy Cohn and Donald Trump, how much do you think Cohn influenced Donald Trump's personal or current political persona, and in what way? We sort of talked about this a little, but if there's anything you want to elaborate on.
This idea that he's a quintessential showman, they met, but the thing that carries through, of course, is that Roy Cohn was friends with, through the Reagan campaign, one of my, again, favorite, using the word favorite in an interesting way here, one of my favorite current political characters is Roger Stone, right? A man who we all now know, who used to return my emails before he started working for the Trump campaign and now doesn't return my emails, but who has a tattoo of Richard Nixon on his back, one of my favorite facts in all of American politics. But Stone ended up being a mentor to Trump. as well. And so there is this link. And the thing that Cohn and Trump and Stone all have in concert with each other is this sense that showmanship is more important than anything else, right? As long there's no such thing as bad press, I think, as Donald Trump almost proves, right? There's no such thing as bad press. Maybe the only bad press that he got that ended up being really tough for him was COVID, that had an impact on his re-election campaign. So there's no such thing as bad press. That the way that you move and talk and your performance matters as much as the content. That's I'd say certainly really important and really key. Unfortunately, and then I would say in some ways this is not unique to Cohn or Trump, but the ideological mercenaryship, right? That Trump doesn't necessarily seem to have a North Star but for himself. And I think that Cohn probably had the same thing. And again, it's not unique to the two of them, but it is a framework that Trump was working in, and that I think Cohn laid the groundwork for.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. Thanks everyone for your great questions and for tuning in tonight on, if you're watching from Minnesota, it's a beautiful day. So thanks for being here with us for this virtual event. I put the phone number to the bookstore and the link to Gossip Men in the chat. So go ahead and check that out. And I just want to thank you, Kevin, for agreeing to be the interviewer for this, and Chris for doing an event with us. This was super fun, and we'll do it when you have a second book.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Annie, so much.
Thank you, Annie. Thank you, Chris. Congratulations.
Have a great night.
A great book.